I stopped halfway down the aisle because the woman sitting in 18A looked up from her phone and stared at me like I had personally arranged the seating chart. Claire Bennett blinked once, glanced at the number above her row, then back at the boarding pass in my hand. "No," she said. I looked at my pass again, even though I already knew what it said. Seat 18B. That's a weird way to greet your best friend. Claire leaned into the empty middle of the row so she could see the paper herself. "You're sitting here?" Apparently Denver International Airport has decided 4 years of friendship isn't enough exposure. She smiled and pulled her bag off the seat beside her. "Or you're stalking me. I booked this flight 3 weeks ago. Exactly what a committed stalker would say." I slid into the seat beside her, still laughing at how ridiculous the coincidence was. Neither of us had mentioned traveling that weekend. Somehow, out of hundreds of passengers and half a dozen flights to Boston, my best friend had ended up close enough to steal my armrest. My name is Ethan Brooks. Claire and I were both 27, and we had been friends since we were 23, when a mutual friend had invited us to the same terrible rooftop birthday party, and Claire had spent 20 minutes making fun of the host's attempt at homemade sangria. We had become the kind of friends who could call each other without a reason, show up at each other's apartments without cleaning first, and insult each other with enough precision to worry strangers. What we did not do was flirt seriously. At least that was the agreement I had quietly made with myself. Claire was attractive enough to make that agreement inconvenient, but friendship had always been easier than asking questions I might not like the answers to. She was flying to Boston to photograph the renovated interior of a boutique hotel. I was going for my cousin's engagement dinner. Completely separate plans, completely separate weekends, and until that moment, completely separate flights in my head. The coincidence made the first hour pass faster than it should have. Claire stole half my pretzels after claiming she was not hungry, criticized the movie I had downloaded without watching a second of it, and informed me that my travel backpack looked like something issued to a divorced geography teacher. "That doesn't even make sense," I told her. "It doesn't have to, look at it." She tapped the front pocket. "That bag has opinions about trail maps." I told her camera case looked like she was transporting a small nuclear device, which only encouraged her. It was normal Claire, quick, confident, impossible to embarrass for longer than 5 seconds. That was why I noticed when the captain announced we would be entering a line of storms ahead, and her smile disappeared before she could replace it. The first bumps were mild. The plane gave a few uneasy shivers, and Claire immediately looked out the window. "You good?" I asked. "Perfect." That sounded convincing. "I fly all the time for work. That wasn't my question." She turned toward me with an offended expression that would have worked better if her fingers were not gripping the edge of her seat. "I don't love turbulence. That sounds different from perfect. I contain multitudes." I smiled, but I stopped teasing her when another jolt shook the cabin hard enough to make several passengers look up. Claire pressed her lips together. I had seen her handle unreasonable clients, a flat tire on the interstate, and an apartment ceiling leaking directly onto her bed without losing her sense of humor. Watching her go quiet over a shaking airplane felt strangely intimate, like I had accidentally opened a door she normally kept locked. The seatbelt sign was already on when the plane entered the worst of it. Rain streaked sideways across Claire's window, and flashes of lightning turned the clouds outside white for a fraction of a second. The aircraft dropped sharply enough that my stomach lifted into my chest. Someone behind us swore. A child started crying farther up the cabin, and the overhead bins rattled with every hard movement. Claire's joking expression disappeared completely. She sat rigidly beside me, breathing too fast and staring straight ahead. "Claire." She shook her head before I had even asked anything. "Don't tell me statistically this is safe. Wasn't planning to." Another drop came, harder than the first. Claire sucked in a breath. I turned slightly toward her, keeping my voice low because there was nothing useful about pretending I could control an airplane. "Look at me instead." Her eyes found mine. "I hate this. I know. No, I really hate this." "Then you can hate it. You don't have to perform competence for row 18. That almost earned me a smile. Then the plane lurched sideways, and Claire's hand moved before either of us had time to think. Her fingers closed around mine so hard that my knuckles knocked against the armrest. A second later, she shifted her grip and threaded her fingers through mine. It was not graceful or tentative. She grabbed me like the cabin had just run out of solid objects and I was the only one left. My first reaction was practical. I turned my hand so she could hold it comfortably and covered the back of hers with my other palm. I've got you. Claire shut her eyes. That phrase is wildly overconfident right now. I've got your hand. Aviation remains outside my department. Her breath broke into something that might have been a laugh if the plane had not dropped again. For the next several minutes, I kept her attention wherever I could. I told her to breathe slower. I reminded her that she still owed me $40 from dinner the previous week and therefore was financially obligated to survive. She informed me, without opening her eyes, that I would never see that money. When the turbulence became violent again, her grip tightened until it genuinely hurt, and I did not move my hand an inch. What bothered me was not the fear. Claire was allowed to be afraid. What bothered me was how natural her hand felt inside mine. 4 years of friendship, hundreds of meals, late-night drives, movie nights, birthday parties, and one ridiculous argument about whether cereal counted as soup, and somehow we had never held hands like this. I should have been thinking about the storm. Instead, some disloyal part of my brain noticed the warmth of her palm and the way her thumb had settled against the side of mine. Eventually, the drops became smaller. The rain outside thinned, and the captain's voice came over the speakers telling us we had passed through the roughest section. The cabin slowly came back to life. People talked again. Someone laughed too loudly with obvious relief. Claire opened her eyes and took one long breath, then another. Still alive, I said. Disappointing for anyone who wanted your $40. She looked at me, pale but recovering, and finally gave me a weak smile. You're never getting that money. Then the friendship is over. Tragic. I expected her to pull her hand away once she realized what she was doing. She didn't. Claire looked down at our interlocked fingers. I watched the recognition reach her face, then the faint color that followed it. The plane was steady now. Her breathing was normal. Nothing was shaking except the occasional vibration beneath our feet, and there was no longer any reason for her to hold on to me like that. Still, her fingers stayed between mine. Claire kept holding my hand for another few seconds before she finally seemed to remember that the storm had stopped giving her an excuse. Her thumb shifted once against mine. Then she pulled away slowly and tucked both hands into her lap. I may have damaged circulation to 3 of your fingers, she said. I flexed them experimentally. 4, actually. I'm contacting an attorney. That got a real laugh out of her, and some color returned to her face, but she still would not quite meet my eyes. I could have asked why she had kept holding on after the turbulence eased. I could also have opened the emergency exit and improved the evening in several equally terrible ways, so I let the question sit between us. For the next 15 minutes, we tried to behave normally and failed in small, embarrassing ways. Claire opened her camera bag, closed it without taking anything out, then asked if I wanted gum, even though she knew I hated the peppermint kind she carried. I put my headphones on and forgot to play anything. Every time our elbows touched on the armrest, one of us moved too quickly, which was ridiculous because an hour earlier she had been trying to turn my hand into orthopedic research. Eventually, Claire glanced sideways at me. Are you going to be weird now? She asked. I was weird before, you just have new data. She smiled, but the question underneath the joke stayed there. The captain came over the speakers again about 20 minutes later, and this time the announcement had nothing to do with turbulence. The storm system had moved directly across our route into Boston, and traffic was backing up badly enough that we were being diverted to Albany to refuel and wait for instructions. A collective groan moved through the cabin. Claire looked at me. So much for our elegant coincidence ending at baggage claim. Maybe the universe is stalking both of us. That would explain your backpack. I should have been annoyed about the delay. Instead, I had the unsettling realization that some part of me was relieved our accidental time together was not ending yet. By the time we landed in Albany, the airline had given up on getting us back into the air that night. The terminal filled with tired passengers staring at phones, arguing politely with gate agents, and forming lines that seemed to reproduce whenever nobody was looking. Claire stood beside me while we waited for hotel information, closer than she normally would have in a crowd. Twice her shoulder pressed against mine and stayed there. When another cluster of passengers cut between us near the service desk, she reached out and caught the sleeve of my jacket until I stepped around them. It was a tiny gesture, probably nothing, except she released me the moment she realized she had done it, and immediately became fascinated by the departure board. The airline provided a discounted hotel block near the airport, and we both ended up booking rooms there because our replacement flight was scheduled for the next morning. We rode the shuttle with 6 strangers who looked personally betrayed by meteorology. Claire sat beside me without discussion. This time she did not hold my hand, but our knees touched whenever the van turned, and neither of us made the usual exaggerated complaint about personal space. I kept telling myself she was still rattled. It was a reasonable explanation, and I liked reasonable explanations because they required very little courage from me. The hotel lobby was almost empty when we arrived. A tired clerk handed us key cards for rooms on the same floor, which felt like another joke the universe had decided not to explain. Claire looked at my room number, then hers. 3 doors apart. Try to control yourself. You're the one following me across multiple states. You literally grabbed me at 30,000 feet. Her expression changed for half a second. The joke had landed too close to the thing we were both avoiding. Right, she said, quieter. I did. We took the elevator up without saying much. Claire leaned against the mirrored wall, exhausted now that the adrenaline was gone, and I watched the floor numbers climb instead of staring at her reflection. At her room, she slid the key card into the lock and pushed the door open. Good night, Brooks. Good night. I started toward my room, genuinely expecting that to be it. Then I heard her door stay open behind me. Ethan? I turned. Claire was still standing there with one hand on the handle, looking less frightened than she had on the plane, and somehow more uncertain. Are you hungry? I glanced at the time on my phone. The hotel restaurant was still open for another 40 minutes. I could eat. Claire nodded too quickly. Good, because I barely had anything on the plane. You ate half my pretzels. Those were crisis pretzels. Different nutritional category. I smiled and walked back toward her. She stepped into the hallway and let the door click shut behind her. There was no turbulence now. No shaking cabin, no lightning outside a tiny window, no reason she needed me close enough to touch, and Claire had just found another reason not to say goodnight. The hotel restaurant was technically still serving dinner, though at that hour it looked more like a room where exhausted travelers had gathered to negotiate with sandwiches. Claire chose a booth near the window, and I sat across from her because sitting beside her suddenly felt like admitting something neither of us had named yet. She ordered grilled cheese and tomato soup. I ordered a burger. For the first few minutes we discussed the diversion, our rearranged morning plans, and whether the airline had intentionally designed its notification system to increase human suffering. It should have felt exactly like 100 meals we had shared before. Instead, every time Claire reached across the table for the ketchup or caught my eye over her glass, I remembered her fingers locked through mine. Apparently, one terrified handhold could make ordinary furniture feel suspicious. Claire eventually dipped one corner of her sandwich into the soup and studied me. You're thinking too loudly. I'm eating. You've been staring at the same French fry for 10 seconds. I picked it up and ate it out of principle. Problem solved, she smiled. You do this whenever there's something you want to ask. Do what? Pretend you're incredibly interested in whatever object is closest to you. She pointed toward my plate. Last month it was a restaurant receipt. Tonight it's a potato. I leaned back. It was a very complicated receipt. It had 4 items. That was Claire's specialty. If she suspected I was uncomfortable, she would circle the subject with jokes until either I gave in or she decided she was equally uncomfortable and escaped first. So I changed direction. Why Boston? I asked. You already know why. I know about the hotel shoot. I meant, why did you take the job? You complained for a week that the client changed the dates twice. Claire shrugged and traced one finger around the rim of her water glass. It's good work. They're giving me a lot of freedom, and I wanted a couple days somewhere else. That last part sounded more personal than professional, but I let it sit. She looked back at me. Your turn. Why are you really going? My cousin is getting engaged. That's the official answer. There's an unofficial answer. Your aunt has been trying to set you up with somebody every time you visit Boston since you were 24. I groaned. Claire grinned. Maybe this is your weekend. Maybe she finally found Mrs. Brooks. That sounds like a threat. Claire laughed, but her eyes stayed on me. You never like anyone I suggest either. That surprised me enough that I stopped reaching for my drink. Over the years, Claire had occasionally pointed out women she thought I might get along with. Once it was a photographer she worked with. Another time it was her friend Allison, who was smart, funny, and perfectly nice. I had gone on exactly one date with Allison and spent most of it wondering whether Claire would approve of the restaurant. I had never considered that Claire had been keeping track. Maybe your recommendations are terrible, I said. Allison was great. She was. Then what was wrong with her? I could have made another joke. Instead, maybe because the night had already become strange enough, I gave her the simple answer. Nothing. I just wasn't interested. Claire went still for a moment. In her, in any of them, her eyebrows lifted. That sounds either romantic or deeply concerning. I'll let you decide. She looked down at her soup, and for once the comeback did not arrive immediately. I wondered if I had said too much, but then she smiled without looking up. Your aunt is going to be devastated. She'll recover. She has a spreadsheet, doesn't she? Probably laminated. Claire laughed again, but something in her expression had changed. It was subtle, just enough to make me wonder whether she had heard more in my answer than I had technically said. I turned the question back on her. What about you? Claire narrowed her eyes. What about me? You've spent 4 years criticizing my romantic judgment. Your own record is not exactly undefeated. My record is selective. Your record contains a man who brought his mother to your second date. She happened to be at the restaurant. She ordered for him. Claire pointed her spoon at me. I was young. You were 26. She kicked my shoe under the table. There was nothing unusual about that. Claire had kicked me under tables before. The unusual part was that her foot stayed against mine afterward, instead of moving away. She noticed it. I knew she noticed because her eyes flicked down for half a second. Then she left her foot exactly where it was. What are you looking for? I asked, keeping my tone lighter than the question felt. Claire leaned back and crossed her arms. In a man? Unless you've recently changed categories. Someone who doesn't own an emotionally beige backpack. That joke is deteriorating. Someone patient, boring, someone funny. Excellent choice. Someone who knows when to stop talking. I nodded. You've lost me. Her smile softened. For 1 second, I thought she might actually answer. Instead, she reached for her sandwich and said, mostly someone who can survive turbulence without making it his entire personality. There it was, the escape hatch. Claire had found the edge of something serious and turned it into a joke before either of us could touch it. We finished dinner without pushing further. When we returned upstairs, we stopped between our rooms. There was an awkwardness there that had never existed between us before, the strange awareness that saying good night might now have options attached to it. Claire tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Thanks for staying with me tonight. You invited me to eat grilled cheese in an airport hotel. Let's not make this heroic. I meant on the plane. I looked at her. She held my gaze for a beat, then another. Anytime, I said. Claire's expression softened, but she only nodded. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Claire. We went into separate rooms, and I spent longer than I would admit wondering whether that had been restraint or cowardice. The answer felt different the next morning. Claire was already waiting near our gate when I arrived with 2 coffees. She looked rested, composed, and completely unlike the frightened woman who had crushed my fingers the night before. I handed her the cup with cinnamon because I had known her order for years. Bribery? She asked. Preventative medicine. Smart. We boarded with the same seats reassigned to us, which made Claire laugh under her breath. Apparently the universe renewed your stalking permit. I filed the paperwork overnight. This time there were blue patches of sky beyond the windows, and the captain predicted a smooth flight. Claire buckled herself in without tension. No white knuckles, no fixed stare, no reason to need anything from me. I deliberately rested my hands in my lap. Claire noticed. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she placed her right hand on the armrest between us, palm down. She looked out the window, shifted once, and slowly turned her hand over until her palm faced upward beside mine. It was such a small movement that anyone else would have missed it. I did not. I looked at her. Claire finally turned toward me, trying and failing to hide a smile. I slid my hand into hers, and her fingers closed around mine with none of yesterday's panic. Already scared? I asked quietly. Claire glanced toward the window. The plane had not even left the gate. Then she looked back at me and squeezed my hand once. Ethan, she said, we're not moving yet. The plane pushed back from the gate with Claire's hand still in mine. That should have made the moment easier to understand. Instead, it removed the last reasonable excuse I had been using since the night before. There was no storm outside, no lightning, no sudden drop. Claire was sitting beside me with a coffee in the cup holder, her camera bag under the seat, and her fingers comfortably threaded through mine like she had decided this belonged in the normal version of our friendship now. I looked down at our hands once. Claire caught me doing it. You're analyzing again. I'm observing. Same thing, but with worse social skills. You voluntarily handed me evidence. She smiled and looked toward the window. Maybe stop treating everything like evidence. I wanted to tell her that would be easier if she stopped doing things I had spent 4 years convincing myself not to imagine. Takeoff was smooth. Claire watched the city shrink beneath us without tightening her grip once. She even released my hand long enough to adjust the air vent above her, which gave me a clean opportunity to leave mine where it was. I could have put on my headphones, I could have reached for my phone, I could have restored the old rules without either of us having to discuss them. Instead, when her hand settled back onto the armrest, I turned mine over and reached for her first. Claire looked down as my fingers slid between hers. Then she looked at me. The teasing expression disappeared for just a moment. "Oh," she said. "What? Nothing. That was definitely something." She squeezed my hand. "You're learning," I laughed quietly. "Don't make this unbearable. Too late." We stayed like that through most of the flight. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes Claire edited photographs on her tablet with one hand while refusing to surrender the other. At one point, she tried to zoom into an image with the wrong fingers and blamed me for reducing her professional abilities. I told her great art required sacrifice. It was stupid and comfortable and exactly like us, except for the fact that every familiar joke now had something warmer underneath it. I no longer needed to wonder whether Claire had held my hand because she was scared. That question had expired before the plane even moved. The harder question was what I intended to do with the answer. Boston was getting closer. Claire had a client meeting that afternoon before photographing the hotel the following morning. My cousin's engagement dinner was at 7:30 p.m. We would reach baggage claim, split toward different rides, and return to the lives we had planned before a storm dropped us into this strange little pocket of honesty. The thought bothered me more every time I checked the flight map. Claire noticed that too. "You keep looking at the arrival time like you're expecting it to insult you." "It might. You have dinner tonight." "I know. And I have a meeting. Also know that." She studied me for a second. "Then why do you look annoyed that Boston still exists?" I looked at our joined hands. Claire had spent the last 18 hours giving me opportunities. She had grabbed me first when she was frightened. She had asked me to eat with her, instead of saying goodnight. This morning, when she was calm and completely free to return to normal, she had opened her palm and waited. I had responded to all of it, but responding was not the same as choosing. If I landed and let her walk away without doing anything clearer, then I would be asking her to carry all the risk while I congratulated myself for being respectful. That did not feel respectful anymore. It felt convenient. "Claire," she turned toward me. "That tone usually means you're about to say something inconvenient." "Probably. Should I prepare emotionally?" "You've had coffee. That's the best I can offer." She smiled, but I did not escape into the joke this time. "I don't want this to become one of those things we explain away later." Her eyes dropped briefly to our hands. I continued before I could make the sentence safer. "I don't want us to get home next week and decide you were scared. I was being supportive, and somehow none of this counted." Claire was quiet. The cabin around us stayed perfectly ordinary. A flight attendant rolled a cart several rows ahead. Someone across the aisle was asleep with his mouth open. There was no dramatic soundtrack, which I appreciated because my pulse was already doing enough. Claire finally looked at me. "Do you think I'm going to do that?" I think both of us are very talented at making things sound less serious than they are. That earned a small, guilty smile. "Fair." I took a breath. "So let's make one thing impossible to explain away." Her expression changed. Not fear this time, attention. "What thing?" "Have dinner with me tonight." Claire blinked. "You already have dinner." "After." "Ethan, your cousin is getting engaged." "I'm aware. I was invited." Her mouth twitched. "You know what I mean. Then tomorrow. Lunch, dinner, coffee, whatever fits around your chute. But not as two friends who happen to get stranded together." I tightened my fingers around hers. "I'm asking you on a date." For once, Claire Bennett had absolutely nothing ready to say. She stared at me long enough that I briefly considered crawling into the overhead bin. "A date," she repeated. "That is generally what people call it. You're serious, unfortunately." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't joke your way out now." "I'm not." I held her gaze. "I'm serious." Something in her face softened, and this time she did not hide it quickly enough. Claire looked down at our hands, then back at me. "Tomorrow night," she said. "My shoot should be done by 6. The relief that moved through me was embarrassing in its intensity. "Tomorrow night works." "And Ethan?" "Yeah?" She tightened her fingers around mine. "If you show up with that backpack, I reserve the right to reconsider." I laughed so hard the sleeping man across the aisle opened one eye. The captain announced our descent 20 minutes later. Claire kept holding my hand while Boston appeared beneath the clouds. When the wheels touched the runway, she did not pull away. Neither did I. For 4 years, every plan we had made together had belonged safely inside friendship. Lunch, movies, concerts, helping each other move furniture, late-night food runs. Now, before either of us had even reached baggage claim, tomorrow night had a different name. And for the first time, neither of us was pretending not to know what that meant. Claire and I separated at baggage claim, which felt stranger than holding her hand through a storm had. She had a car waiting for her client meeting, and my cousin had already sent 3 messages asking whether I was alive and whether flight delays counted as an acceptable excuse for missing afternoon drinks. Claire stood beside her suitcase with one hand around the handle and looked at me as if we were both trying to figure out the correct procedure for saying goodbye to someone who had been your best friend yesterday and had agreed to date you today. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., she asked. I'll be there. She narrowed her eyes, without the backpack. You're becoming controlling very early in this relationship. Her expression changed at the word relationship, just slightly. I noticed because I had apparently become professionally qualified to notice Claire Bennett's face. Go see your family, Brooks. Go photograph expensive furniture. She smiled, touched 2 fingers briefly to my wrist, and walked toward the exit. I watched her go until she disappeared into the crowd, then realized I was smiling at a luggage carousel like a man who needed supervision. Being apart for the afternoon turned out to be useful. The whole previous day had happened inside airports, planes, hotel hallways, and bad weather, an accidental little world where normal rules had been suspended. My cousin's engagement dinner dragged me firmly back into ordinary life. There were relatives asking about work. My aunt attempting to introduce me to a woman named Caroline before dessert, and my cousin making an emotional speech that would have embarrassed him permanently if anybody had recorded it. Claire and I exchanged only a few messages. She sent me a photo of an absurdly expensive hotel chair and asked whether I thought it looked comfortable. I told her it looked judgmental. She replied that this was why nobody hired me for interiors. We did not discuss the plane. We did not discuss the date. Somehow that made tomorrow feel more real, not less. The following evening, I arrived at the restaurant 12 minutes early and immediately regretted everything about being 12 minutes early. I checked the reservation twice, adjusted my jacket, and considered whether normal people suddenly forgot how chairs worked before dates with women they had known for 4 years. Claire arrived at 6:58 p.m. wearing dark jeans, a soft cream sweater, and the expression of someone who knew exactly what she was doing to me. She stopped in front of the table and looked me over. You look nervous. I was worried you might bring a measuring tape and rate the restaurant design. I already did that from the sidewalk. She sat down, smiling. Relax, Ethan, you've had dinner with me before. Not like this. Her teasing softened for half a second. No, she said, not like this. That difference was there all evening. But it did not destroy the parts of us I had been afraid of losing. Claire still stole fries without asking. I still told her the cocktail she ordered tasted like furniture polish. She still accused me of having the palate of a suburban father at a chain steakhouse. What changed was permission. When her knee touched mine beneath the table, neither of us pretended it was an accident. When I told her she looked beautiful, she did not turn it into an insult before accepting it. She just smiled, looked down for a second, and said, "Thank you." We did not spend dinner dissecting 4 years of friendship or demanding definitions from each other. We talked about Boston, her shoot, my family, places we wanted to travel, and whether my aunt would survive discovering that her matchmaking efforts were no longer required. The friendship was still there. It had simply stopped being the only thing allowed in the room. After dinner, we walked without much of a destination. The air was cool, the sidewalk still damp from an earlier shower, and the sky above Boston was completely clear. Claire was telling me about a client who had moved the same lamp 7 times when her hand brushed mine. She stopped talking. I looked down just as her fingers slid deliberately between mine. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Perfectly." I glanced up at the cloudless sky. "No storm?" Claire followed my gaze, then looked back at me with a smile. "Not even turbulence. Interesting. Don't ruin it. I'm gathering data." She squeezed my hand. "There is your data." I stopped walking. Claire took another half step before our joined hands pulled gently between us, and she turned back. There was no emergency now, no shaking cabin, and no frightened instinct making the decision for either of us. I stepped closer, slowly enough that she had every chance to decide what happened next. Claire looked at my mouth, then up at me, and the playful confidence in her expression gave way to something warmer. "You're analyzing again," she murmured. "Actually, I'm trying something new." "What's that, making a decision?" She smiled just before I kissed her. It was not dramatic. Nobody applauded. Nothing fell from an overhead compartment. Claire simply lifted one hand to the front of my jacket and kissed me back, like this was something she had already decided she wanted. When we separated, she stayed close enough that I could feel her laugh against my chest. "That was better than turbulence," she said. "Low standard. You still cleared it." Then she took my hand again and started walking, as if holding it had become the easiest thing in the world. The storm did not make Claire fall for me, and it did not suddenly turn 4 years of friendship into romance. It only created one moment when neither of us had time to protect the old rules. What mattered was what happened afterward, when the sky was clear and we chose the same thing again without needing an excuse.
The weekend makes sense once you separate the accidents from the choices. Ethan and Claire had 4 years of history behind them. Enough to tease each other, rely on each other, and avoid asking whether that closeness had ever become something more. Sitting together on the flight to Boston seemed like a funny coincidence until the storm stripped away all of that practiced ease. Claire, normally confident and quick with a joke, became genuinely frightened, and when the turbulence turned violent, she reached for Ethan's hand without thinking. At first, that handhold had an obvious explanation. Claire was scared. Ethan was the person beside her she trusted, and he did what a best friend would do by keeping her calm and staying with her through the worst of the turbulence. The problem was that the explanation stopped fitting once the plane steadied. Claire kept her fingers linked with his even after the danger had passed, and Ethan noticed not only that she stayed, but that he did not want her to let go. From that point on, both of them became unusually aware of gestures that had once felt completely ordinary. The diversion to Albany gave them more time together instead of allowing them to disappear back into separate weekend plans. Claire found reasons to stay close in the terminal, invited Ethan to dinner after they reached the hotel, and their conversation began moving towards subjects they usually protected with humor. Ethan admitted that the women Claire had suggested to him had never interested him, while Claire's questions made it clear that she had been paying attention to his dating life too. Neither of them made a confession that night, but the old definition of their friendship was already becoming harder to defend. The next morning removed the last excuse. Claire was calm, the weather was good, and the plane was still sitting at the gate when she turned her palm upward beside Ethan and waited. He took her hand, and later when she briefly let go, he was the one who reached for her again. That mattered because fear was no longer making the choice for either of them. Before they reached Boston, Ethan finally stopped responding to Claire's signals and made one of his own by asking her on a real date. Boston then gave them the chance to find out whether the connection only belonged to airports, storms, and delayed flights. It did not. Their date still sounded like Ethan and Claire, full of stolen fries, jokes, familiar arguments, and the ease they had built over 4 years. But now they allowed attraction to exist beside the friendship instead of immediately explaining it away. When Claire reached for his hand during their walk under a clear sky, Ethan finally answered with an equally deliberate choice and kissed her. By then, the pattern was impossible to dismiss. The seat assignment put them together, the storm exposed how instinctively Claire trusted Ethan, and the delay created time neither of them had planned to spend together. But the steps that actually changed the relationship came later, when the danger was over and either of them could have returned to the old rules. Claire offered her hand again, Ethan asked for the date, and both of them kept choosing closeness when there was no longer an external reason to do it. A storm is dramatic, but the harder thing Ethan and Claire have to survive is much quieter, giving up the safety of plausible deniability. Ethan is not afraid that Claire is wrong for him. He is afraid of putting a name on something valuable and discovering that the name changes it. Claire has a similar instinct, using jokes whenever a conversation gets too close to the truth, so both of them have spent years protecting the friendship by refusing to test what else might be there. The healthier shift happens when the risk stops belonging to only one person. Claire takes the first involuntary step during the storm, then a deliberate one the next morning when she offers her hand before takeoff. Ethan eventually recognizes that simply accepting every signal from her while making none of his own would leave Claire carrying all the vulnerability. Asking her on a date is important precisely because it is not another response to an emergency. It is his decision. Romance also does not erase the friendship that made them matter to each other in the first place. Their date is still full of stolen food, familiar insults, and the easy rhythm they already know. The real change is that they stop using those habits as camouflage whenever affection becomes obvious. That makes the clear sky in Boston more important than the turbulence, because the relationship begins only after both of them are free to retreat and choose not to. Claire turning her palm upward while the plane was still at the gate may be the quietest moment in the story, but it says almost everything. Which moment made you think their friendship had clearly crossed into something more? The first handhold, the hotel dinner, the second flight, or the kiss in Boston? Share your pick in the comments, and like and subscribe if you want more slow burn stories where one small choice changes the whole relationship.